The Addis Brushworks. Addis really revolutionised dental hygiene in this country, and for a huge part of their lifespan they were based here in Hartford, but their story starts a bit earlier. So I think just to fully understand how it worked, we need to have a quick whip through the history of the Addis Company. William Addis made the first ever toothbrush in 1780. Now, this was a really fortuitous time to come up with this invention. From around 1750 onwards, people started to be a bit more interested in personal hygiene. There were more vaccinations coming out. People were using soap more regularly. People started to wear cotton rather than sort of soggy, fetid woolens. So there was an increased interest in health. But it was also a time when there was a huge amount of sugar coming into Britain, and people were really getting a taste for it, getting sweet tooth, and this was affecting the state of their teeth all round. And really, in the 18th century, if you were having problems with your teeth, you didn't have a lot of options. You might have to go like this poor gentleman here for a very, very painful extraction. Doesn't look pleasant. And that would leave you with lots of gaps in your gums. And then you might be able to look forward to a nice pair of wooden teeth like this. Or if you're a bit more comfortably off, you could have an ivory dental plate made. And in fact, at the time, there were a lot of stories of corpses being defiled, having their teeth forcibly removed from bodies in order for people to make these dental plates. So yeah, there really wasn't much about in terms of dental care at the time. But when William Addis came up with his invention, it was originally for his own use. He really saw the commercial possibilities with it. Now, he was born in 1734 and he was a stationer and a rag merchant based in Whitechapel. And the materials he used to make this toothbrush were animal bone and horsehair. So they were sort of leftover items that he had ready access to as a rag merchant. And when he came up with this toothbrush, he thought, you know, other people might like it, but because of being a stationer as well, he had the connections to get it out to a greater population. Now, at that time, booksellers sold medicines and chemist sundries. So William was able to get this into bookshops, and that's where they were first sold. And it soon took off. It became very fashionable. You know, you weren't anybody if you didn't have this new exciting toothbrush. And I'm not saying people were brushing twice a day, but, you know, if they're brushing once a week, they were feeling pretty smart about it. But William had 3 sons who all went into the business, and he changed the name to William Addis and Son. Now, his eldest son, William Addis II, really grew the business. He was 21 when he took it over, but he was already skilled in brush making. And as it grew, they had to move premises a few times, and they ended up at Herbert Street in Hoxton. And by 1840, William had 60 staff working for him there, and a lot more people working at home. A lot of the brush making was done in piecework, and there were things that people could do at home. So again, a lot of women were involved in doing this while they were at home looking after children. But he didn't stop at toothbrushes. He made curl brushes, bonnet brushes, and nail brushes as well. And as I say, the business really progressed. And he was very interested in how he might improve brush making. And he even sent off to Africa for a consignment of giraffe bones, thinking, well, they're bigger than ox bones and I can get more brushes out of them. Here are 2 in the picture. They're part of the Addis collection here at Hartford Museum. But he found that they were too coarse and porous and just weren't really up for the job. So making brushes, how is it done? So it didn't change for a really long time. So even in William II's time, this is pretty much the process. A thigh bone of an ox, they chop the ends off because they don't want those, and then they're boiled up to remove any grease and any unpleasantness associated with animal bone. And then they're cut into various lengths. Now, there were 4 main lengths: gents, ladies, children's, and a very small brush called a tom thumb. And then after that, they're fashioned into something slightly more resembling a toothbrush. And as you can see, it starts off a bit rectangular, then it's profiled, and then fashioned into something that we would recognise as a toothbrush handle. And then the drilling and graving takes place. Now, all the toothbrush backs were hand drilled with little holes. These are for the bristles to go through. And the long vertical lines you can see are called graves. And this is to sort of secrete the excess wire after the bristles are wired in. And that's where they will slot in and live. Bristle mostly came from Russia, from boars, and after they've been drilled, they were tumbled in water and whiting for 10 hours to give them a really nice smooth surface, and then bleached by strong sunlight. Later on, Addis actually used hydrogen peroxide for that part of the process. And then they were sent out for drawing, and this was a lot of the work that people would do in their homes. So the brush handle is held in a vise, and the bristles are wired in with silver wire. You can see this happening here. And once that's done, they're trimmed up the gauge. Any little tiny bits of wire that are left are pushed into the graves, and then that has to be filled in. There's not a very good photograph there in the middle where you can see it's covered with a sort of resinous wax, and later on they use cement and sometimes even enamel to fill in those graves. And then the excess is wiped off and you just have some very smart thin lines in whatever colour you've chosen. And there is the finished brush. They'd be washed again and inspected before being packed up. And here you can see the brush we've seen in the stages, the Regison toothbrush, and some of the little drills that we use for making those graves and bristle holes. So William II, his eldest son, also William III, already a very skilled brush maker, brought up in the business, and he took over in the 1860s. He was really interested in mechanisation, and this was a time when a lot of industries in Britain were looking to machines to replace some of their workforce. And he brought some in very early, and people weren't very happy. A lot of his workers objected. They were very skilled craftsmen. They didn't see how a machine could take over the job that they'd been doing. But he brought in some machines to make handles and backs and for drilling holes for the bristles, and then some shaping machines which were operated by a treadle. And then by 1869, Addis were able to claim in their advertising that their toothbrushes were made by machinery, but they were still being filled by hand. And again, the business just continued to grow. And under William III, they were making 29 different brands of toothbrush, 13 types of shaving brush, and 6 types of nail brush. And you can see one of their price lists here, an example of some of the brushes. In this photograph, the big tufty one, that's a neck brush. There are hat brushes, ringlet brushes, shaving brushes, clothes brush. At the front, you've got a glove stretcher, all made in the same way from bone and bristle. Now in this photograph, it's a lovely family photograph, seated at the left in the middle row, the portly gentleman with the cane, that is William III. Sat next to him is his father, William II. Now go along a couple, second in from the right in that middle row is William IV, William III's eldest son. And his second eldest son, Robert, is sitting on the floor in the middle in the front row. William III had 7 sons that went into the business, but 3 of them were really sort of most involved, and that was William, Robert, and their younger brother Charles. And William, Robert, and Charles became partners in the business when William III passed away. But it didn't really work out very well, as the eldest brother, William IV, was in charge, and he wasn't really happy to share any of the decision making with his brothers, and Robert didn't take very kindly to this. So in 1893 the partnership was dissolved, and William IV gave £800 each to his brothers Robert and Charles, but Charles stayed on at Herbert Street as his brother's employee. But on the very day that the partnership was dissolved, Robert set up his own business in London Fields and started writing to potential customers. So he set up his new factory at London Fields. He's written to some customers. He's taken on 2 boys and 2 brush makers. So it's not a bustling concern at the moment. But within a year, he was employing 50 staff and had large customers like Mappin and Webb. And he'd even supplied toothbrushes to Marshall Field in Chicago. So he'd made a huge success of it. And he really needed a bit of extra help, so he took his son, Robert II, out of school, aged 15, to help him. Now, Robert II had a very keen mechanical mind. He was interested in draftsmanship and machinery, so he was a huge addition to the firm. And things were going very, very well until 1898, when the Bone Brushmakers Union went on strike for 7 months. Now, this was a huge problem. They were after increased pay, but Robert didn't take it personally. He had a good relationship with his workforce. And in fact, during the strike, he was going outside and providing tea and tobacco to the picketers. Unfortunately, his brother, William IV, over in Hoxton, took the opposite view, and he fought the picketers to the point where basically he and his eldest son were running the factory single-handedly, and his son contracted pneumonia while stoking the steam boiler and died. William went on to lose his biggest customer. Really, his heart went out of things, and he died in 1900. But Robert had maintained good relationships with his sister-in-law and purchased the business from William's widow and amalgamated it. So Addis was one company once again. At this point, Robert II, Robert's son, marries Caroline Mary Maud Hamilton, and here she is in the photograph, with her husband Robert II, Robert I glowering in the background. Robert and Caroline had 1 child, their son, Robert III, And here he is pictured. And Caroline had a bit of time on her hands with only having one child, and she really threw herself into the family business. She was supervising the women workers, taking telephone orders, and really supporting her husband and her father-in-law. And by 1914, the company was employing 84 staff plus home workers. They were exporting products around the world, especially to the United States, and their turnover was around £30,000. That's the equivalent to 3.5 million today. But as Robert I, his health sort of disintegrated a little bit, and old age really was taking its toll, Robert II and Caroline really took on the running of the business. But Robert started to feel that Hackney perhaps wasn't the best place. And after his father died in 1918, he started scouting around for somewhere in the home counties. The problem with Hackney, not only was the area deteriorating, there were another 13 brushworks in the area. So it was a problem for your labour force. They could go around the other brushworks, perhaps looking for a better deal, better employment rates, better salary, things like that. So he wanted to take his factory somewhere where he wasn't going to have that sort of competition for his workforce. And eventually he found the site of the old steam laundry in Hartford, which he bought for £4,500. It was perfect. It was 3.5 acres because they'd had a lot of space for drying clothing, and it was just right. So it was going to be a big task to set up this new factory. So Robert II took his son, Robert III, out of school, aged 14, and asked him to help him set up the new factory. Robert III had learnt brush making from the age of 12, so he, again, brought up in the business, knew what he was about, but his father wanted him to take on extra responsibility, learn how to be in charge, and put him in charge of a team of builders, and he was authorised to pay wages and sign cheques, aged just 14. And here is the Addis factory in Hartford on Ware Road just after it opened. Some key men from Hackney, some of the skilled brush makers, were brought up and installed in cottages that Addis had purchased for that purpose. And they ran an ad in the local paper offering training in toothbrush making, particularly for women and girls. The ad was so successful they were completely overrun. They had to call a police constable to maintain order, but ultimately they employed a dozen or so girls, some older women, and a few men and boys for the maintenance and packing side of things. And here is the Addis factory in Hartford about the same time, and you can see the workforce is predominantly female. They opened a showroom on Ware Road at the front so potential clients could come in and look at the finished products themselves. And here it is from the air, around 1922. You'll notice the badminton court. We have oral history recordings from former employees who learnt how to play badminton at the factory. So we'll just have a little stroll around inside the factory here. This is in the first few years of operation, these photographs. So we've got some men here sawing ox bones on circular saws. They are fashioning the handles and planing them. Now these girls here, who look frighteningly young, are drilling holes and making the graves inside the back of the bone handles. This little girl on the right, she's got a huge stack of handles in front of her. She doesn't look older than about 9, but I imagine she was probably 14. This was a particularly glamorous job in the factory, nitpicking. All of this boar bristle coming in from Russia was sort of riddled with lice. So these had to be removed as well as any egg cases. And these girls are in this particularly unpleasant job, but it was one where you needed a lot of concentration. You'll notice that the girls have got their aprons actually pinned to the table. This is because the bristle was so expensive, you couldn't drop any on the floor and lose it. If you dropped any, it would land in your apron and could be retrieved. And this actually went on really throughout the history of Addis to the middle of the 20th century. An oral history recording that we have from a lady that worked there, Elizabeth Ingram, calls Mr. Addis coming in with his tweezers and looking around and seeing if anybody had a stray bristle on their overalls and picking them off and putting them back on the desk with his tweezers. So again, nothing was wasted. Here, this lady is drawing the toothbrush, so she's inserting the bristles. You can see on the right she's got a reel of silver wire and a stack of bristles. They're held in the vise there so that she can work without it moving around. And branding. Addis made toothbrushes for lots of other companies, as mentioned earlier, Mappin and Webb, and these companies would like to have their own brand stamped onto the toothbrush handles. So this is what these girls are doing. They're stamping brands on. And packing, this looks like probably the nicest job. And again, boxing these up, ready to go out to the shops. So things were all going very swimmingly in the early 20s. So much so that there was a huge celebrated project of a doll's house being constructed for Queen Mary, and companies around the country who were seen as the best in their field were approached to make miniature versions of their product for this doll's house, whether they're cabinet makers or what have you. And Addis were asked to produce some brushes for Queen Mary's doll's house in 1923, and Robert II took on this task himself, painstakingly making these tiny, tiny little brushes, and they're in the doll's house at Windsor Castle today. But there was a fly in the ointment, in that there was a famine going on in Russia, which really affected the supply of bristle. People were eating the pigs more quickly than bristle could be grown on them, and this really affected the supply. So Robert II looked further afield. He went to China, and China now, in fact, are the sort of leader in bristle supply around the world. But by 1926, the Addis factory here in Hertford was producing 1.8 million toothbrushes. Robert wasn't going to rest on his laurels. He'd always been quite interested in the new plastics coming out, but his father, Robert I, hadn't been keen. He thought they were a bit cheap and nasty. But since he'd passed away, Robert II was free to explore the new plastics coming in. And he purchased 2 machines from Germany. He learned how to use them and later developed his own for drilling and filling toothbrushes. But the early plastic was cellulose nitrate, and there's a problem with that in that it's extremely flammable. So it had to be kept in these huge water tanks at the back of the factory site. But the creation of these new plastic toothbrushes at much less expense led to a huge contract with Woolworths, which really skyrocketed the company. At this point, late 20s, toothbrushes were still seen as something that not everybody might have. They weren't that affordable. But these new plastic, brightly coloured toothbrushes sold very, very cheaply in Woolworths, meant that everybody got them. And this is really, from 1927, 28, when everybody in the country starts having a toothbrush. And they were saying at the time that even tramps were carrying a toothbrush. Robert was very, very excited about this new development. Now, we have a huge number of plastic toothbrushes from the Addis collection here at the museum, and we have a huge problem with them deteriorating. And I know that sounds strange when we're always hearing about plastics in our sea and plastics are taking forever and spoiling the environment, but these early plastics do deteriorate. Toothbrush, you can see at the bottom of the screen, you can see that mottling, it's starting to crack inside, the structure is breaking down. And this is very, very difficult for us to manage because they start giving off a sort of vinegary smell, and some of them go melty, some of them crack and break. But the most difficult part is that this is contagious to other plastics. So we have to monitor all of our plastic toothbrushes very, very regularly and just see what condition they're in. And if we see something starting to go, it has to be taken out, and we have a special sort of hospice box for our deteriorating plastics. There's nothing that can be done, it's just palliative care, but they're kept away from other plastics so that they can't infect them. And what's been quite interesting for us over the years, we've been working with Bournemouth University in an Arts Council funded project looking at deterioration rates of plastics. So our collections are allowing people to find out how quickly plastics deteriorate and at what rate. So it's very, very exciting for us to be a big part of that. Anyway, back to the Addis factory. So 1930, all of the plastics are taking off, the company's doing brilliantly well, and Robert II sets his sights to expand abroad, and he goes to Australia and sets up Addis Australia in Sydney. And there's this lovely photograph of the brand new sparkly Australian employees in 1930, which was presented to him, again, predominantly girls. And so this started off pretty well. Later on in Australia, they opened up a warehouse in Melbourne, which is the picture in the top right. And they also then closed the Sydney office and opened a brand new purpose-built factory just outside Sydney in a town called Ryde. And Addis Australia continued until 2002. So back to Britain, back to Ware Road. It's the 1930s. Addis are doing spectacularly well. They're selling 14.5 million toothbrushes a year. They've really built up their engineering facilities. They're not just buying machines, they're designing machines for their own purposes, and they are training men to operate them and to take care of them. And they get a brand new spanking frontage designed by Donald Hamilton. It won awards in 1935, and this just told everybody what a successful company they were. Robert II died in 1937, and his son Robert III, with his mother Caroline, continued to run the factory. And they were very interested in, again, expanding the plastic sides of things. And so Robert III bought some injection molding machines. This would really speed up the plastic side of things. It would make it cheaper to produce them. He was interested in nylon as a new product for bristles to replace animal bristle. ICI had the contract for distributing nylon in Britain, so he negotiated with them. They were Handley and Welwyn. Here's some ICI employees at Welwyn here on the left of the screen. And once he'd got these new materials and the new machines, he launched a brand new toothbrush called Wisdom, which is a very, very familiar name to all of us today. So then came the war. Robert had really anticipated this. He'd stockpiled bristles ahead of the war, and now with the new nylon bristles, he was feeling a bit more confident. And the government in 1938 gave Addis an order for 100,000 bone brushes. Now they wanted bone and not plastic because the plastic brushes were flammable, so they didn't want their servicemen having these flammable toothbrushes. So it was the traditional bone toothbrushes that they made. And you can see in the center of the screen, that's one of the Addis Armed Forces toothbrushes. But the company were a huge part of the war effort. They not only made toothbrushes for the armed forces, they made equipment for them as well. On the top right, this is for cleaning a tank periscope. Bottom left, that's for cleaning a tank cannon. These brushes weren't just made by Addis for the Ministry of Defence, they were designed and built there as well. So Addis engineers were coming up with these ideas to support the war effort. And in fact, it wasn't just equipment that they were making, they were also storing things. There were two Nissan hats on the Addis site with 2 aeroplanes inside them, and this was because the government squirreled planes around the country in various locations so that if anything happened to a local airfield, they had an aircraft somewhere in the vicinity. So all of this was really all about the war effort. Here's a nice quote from Reg Preston about some of the equipment he was making at the Addis factory. He was deferred from entering the service because his work was so important. So at the end of the war, a lot of the women employees had to step up to senior roles, and Addis were very concerned about making sure those jobs were still there for returning servicemen. And if any of the jobs had been replaced by machines, what with the new injection molding machines, they retrained those men for other aspects of work in the factory. And in fact, they took such great care that a memo was sent out telling the female employees that if your husband was demobbed, you would be allowed to leave early so that you could get home and get his tea on. So they had a lot of concern for their workers during the war. But the Wisdom toothbrush that they'd created during that time had taken off to such an extent that demand exceeded what Hartford could produce. So Robert went and bought this silk mill at Haverhill in Suffolk. And as you can see in the photograph on the right, behind the beautiful old mill building are all of the Addis factory buildings. And Haverhill carried on here into the 80s. You can see people packing brushes. Those 1980s injection molding machines are slightly different to the ones that we've seen already. And Haverhill is still running. So where next? Well, Robert III took a holiday to the continent in 1951, where he saw somebody using a wooden washing up brush, and he thought this was a marvellous idea. So he came up with his own design for a plastic washing up brush, which he called the Bridget. And a sales force was put together to try and promote homewares, this new product, around the country. And what was wonderful about the Addis homewares selection was that its superiority to the old sort of wooden and bristle cleaning brushes was the non-drip loo brush. Once you'd used your loo brush, if you had bristle, it would have absorbed water and be dripping it around. Your nylon loo brush, give it a little shake and it's nice and dry. So housewives lapped these up, and the homeware section really expanded. And to the point where in 1957, all the toothbrushes were moved to Haverhill, and Hartford was focused solely on homeware. And the phrase was, lighten your work and brighten your home. And they specialised in these brightly coloured, beautiful items, especially gift sets for weddings and christenings. Here, top left, is an Addis wedding gift set. I'm sure your friend would be delighted to be presented on her wedding day with this beautiful set of scrubbing brushes. So again, it was expanding to the point where even with Haverhill, it wasn't going to be enough. And so Robert bought up some brush companies in Sunderland, Swansea and Suffolk to expand this. So here's the site in Swansea, and they eventually moved to an old army munitions site and converted that into a factory. And here you can see this photograph on the top left is probably about the 70s. Again, predominantly female workforce. Bottom right is a hairbrush handle making machine. But Britain wasn't enough, so Robert looked abroad again. And rather than setting up their own factories as such, Addis worked with manufacturers in different countries around the world to produce Addis products under the Addis name. And they would recruit men from the Hartford factory to go out and help set up these factories, get them going, teach them what to do, train up the staff, and then they would come back. And you can see a memo here from 51 asking somebody to go to South Africa. The South African Addis factory is still going today. And here are some various advertisements that were used in the press around the world for Addis products. Back in Hartford, this photograph from the mid-60s, you can see the extent of the factory. And if you look on the left, you can see the Art Deco front and all of these factory sheds behind it. And the company continued to operate out of Hartford, again, predominantly homewares, and a lot of the tasks were quite similar if they had advanced a little bit. You see bottom right, these ladies are nitpicking in the 70s. This was improved by the fact that now the bristles were put in a special bath of a cleaning fluid which killed all the lice, so you didn't have to contend with any live ones hopping about, but you still had to remove any nasty old egg cases. And again, this was still done by hand. On the left, you've got Beryl Wrangles operating the hairbrush machine. While machines had taken a lot of the work out of it, it was still very skilled work to operate these machines, and they were monitored very, very closely. This photo, I imagine, was probably taken around 1990, not long before the factory closed. Again, here is the female workforce. And unfortunately, in 1994, the company was starting to look pretty unprofitable. They set up Addis Homewares as a sister company, so independent of Addis itself, but it just wasn't working. It was built on a model from earlier in the century, and it wasn't operating profitably anymore. And very sadly, in 1996, the family took the decision, the board of directors took the decision to sell the company in a management buyout. There was nobody in the Addis family who was willing to take it on, and it was the right decision at the time. But it was not the end of Addis. Addis still operate out of the site in Haverhill. This is the team at Haverhill, top right of your photograph there. That was taken in about 2002. Addis continues in name and spirit still. Wisdom still operates out of, Addis operating out of Swansea, and Wisdom is still operating out of Haverhill. So those sites, those factories still continue. The Addis names, Addis, Wisdom, are still continuing around the world. But it was a huge part of life in Hartford. Employed nearly 1,000 people either in the factory or as home workers for a very, very long time, and they were part of everyday life here. Here's an early works outing to the seaside. This was an Addis staff party at the Shire Hall Assembly Rooms. I like the saucy but quite okay girl there in fancy dress. And there were also other staff benefits. So there was the Addis 25 Club for staff members who had 25 years service. There was also a 50 Club, and they were presented with a beautiful watch or clock. And one member of staff actually asked if he could be presented with a pigeon racing clock because he didn't want to watch, but was a very keen pigeon racer. This is Leslie Nottage at his 25 Club ceremony, being congratulated by Robert Addis IV, known as Robin. And once the company had gone, Robin was left with a huge archive of Addis material. And so he approached the museum and very, very kindly donated this valuable archive to the museum. This article from the Mercury states 1,000 toothbrushes. It is very incorrect. We have about 6,300 Addis items in our collection, a range of things. Within that, about 3,500 toothbrushes. It's the largest collection of toothbrushes in the world. I have to go and contest the Guinness Book of Records. Some guy in Russia thinks he's got the largest one with 1,500. So we're going to spoil that for him very soon. But it is a fascinating archive of an industry and of a leader in their industry. Here in this photograph from the Mercury also you can see our volunteers Terry and Fran, who were given the momentous task when these toothbrushes were donated of sorting and organising and cataloguing, and that took us about well over 10 years to do. So here are just a few of the sorts of things within our Addis archive. In the top centre, you can see this is a mouth cleaner with the sponge. On the right, this is one of the vices used for holding toothbrushes for drawing. There are advertisements. These instruments of torture are actually dental plate brushes, eyebrow brushes, napkin rings, all of the homewares. Pretty much anything you can think of is within the archive, as well as hundreds and hundreds of photographs, memos, administrative letters. It is a complete capsule of the history of an industry. So I really hope that you've enjoyed finding out about Addis in Hartford. Again, if you've got any questions, do email me. We've got loads of our Addis photographs on our image library website, hartfordmuseumimages.org. And once more, again, if you are able to, we would be very, very grateful if you're able to make a donation by going on our website, hartfordmuseum.org, and scrolling down to the donate button. It would really help us out. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I'll be looking at some of Hartford's lost buildings, so I hope you can join me then. Thank you. Bye-bye.